grateful to Art History Department Administrative Associate Joanna Ritt for all of her organizational help, and we acknowledge KU student Marlene Cerrone for the poster design. I'm honored to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Lara Blanchard. I'm going to pause now. No, I'm going to keep going. We're hoping that those of you watching on YouTube are able to see and follow us. Okay. Okay, I think we're good. Good. So, I'm honored to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Lara Blanchard, who is Luce Professor of East Asian Art and Lloyd Wright Professor in Conservative Studies at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, where she has taught since 2001. Dr. Blanchard earned her master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Michigan and her bachelor's degree from the College of William and Mary. In addition to her extensive teaching, advising, and service at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and significant service to the discipline, Dr. Blanchard is an active and productive scholar. Her interdisciplinary research interests include gender and art in China, text-image relationships, and Chinese theories of representation. She's the author of the book, Sung Dynasty, Figures of Longing and Desire, Gender and Interiority in Chinese Painting and Poetry, published by Brill in 2018, which won the Joseph Levinson Pre-1900 Book Prize for China from the Association for Asian Studies in 2020. She also won the Faculty Prize for Scholarship from Hobart and William Smith Colleges in 2020. She's the co-editor of the book Gender, Continuity, and the Shaping of Modernity in the Arts of East Asia, published by Brill in 2017, and co-author of the textbook Asian Art, published by Pearson in 2015. Dr. Blanchard has also published many refereed journal articles, book chapters, and reviews, and has given numerous lectures and symposium and conference presentations on a wide range of topics in Chinese art history. Dr. Blanchard's lecture this evening will be followed by a question and answer session moderated by DEAI committee member Ruiying Gao. Please type your questions for Dr. Blanchard into the chat in YouTube, either during or immediately following her talk. And I'm now happy to turn the screen over to her for her lecture, The Women Artists of the Banana Garden Poetry Club, Text Image Exchanges, Friendship, Family, and Identity in 17th Century China.
Hello, everybody. Sorry for the delay. I'm having trouble getting my computer to cooperate. Hold on just a minute. Okay, let me do this. Okay, hopefully everybody is seeing my screen and can hear me. And of course, hope somebody will let me know if that's actually not the case. I want to thank everybody so much for inviting me to speak, and I want to thank David for his introduction. And I want to begin by saying that I feel that my work on Chinese women artists in the late imperial era owes a debt to the scholarship of University of Kansas Professor Emerita Marcia Hoeffler, particularly the catalog for the exhibition Views from Jade Terrace. So I would like to start by acknowledging her work with gratitude. Hold on a minute. Shoot. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out something about video of me. There we go. Okay, I think it works. All right. Tonight I want to talk about a group of women in 17th century Hangzhou who formed a literary association called the Banana Garden Poetry Club. These women ended up becoming highly admired poets. Their work was published both in single-authored collections during their own lifetimes, as well as in anthologies of poetry in the Qing dynasty. And feminist literary scholars in particular have done a great deal of research on the writings of this group. I, of course, am an art historian. And so the thing that particularly intrigues me about the creative output of these women is the written evidence that they made paintings, and that the paintings often inspired a circuit of exchange, leading the women to write about their artwork in letters, inscriptions, and poems. These artistic collaborations reveal the close friendships among these women, many of whom were related to each other by marriage. And they clarify how these women saw their connections as an integral part of their identities. Evidently, these artists did not define themselves solely in relation to their parents, husbands, or children, which is what the assumption tends to be for Chinese women of the gentry class in the imperial era. If you know, for example, the Confucian idea of three followings, which defines the way that Chinese women deferred to men throughout their lifetimes, that a girl follows her father, a woman follows her husband, and a widow follows her son. In many ways, the interactions of the Banana Garden poets recall aspects of men's literary associations, demonstrating how these Qing dynasty women adapted a male model of friendship to their own circumstances. At the outset, I do need to mention the major stumbling block I have had in putting together this talk. Almost no examples of these women's paintings seem to survive. What we mainly have is written descriptions of the artwork or poems written in response to the artwork. This is enough to give us a feeling for what the artwork was like, and in some cases why it was made, or how it made its female viewers feel. So, to fill in the gaps, I'm going to be showing you examples of paintings, but for various reasons, they are paintings that I am thinking may be comparable in some way to the missing paintings by the Banana Garden poets. They have subject matter that is similar, for example. They are paintings from close to the same time and from the same general region of China, the Jiangnan region, southeastern China. I have this map here showing the Jiangnan region. The Banana Garden Poetry Club was based in the city of Hangzhou. Which is, hopefully you can see when I point at the screen with my mouse. It's actually located here, head of the Qiantang River. The paintings I will be showing you were made in that city, or in Changshu, which is quite a bit further north, or Suzhou, which is located here next to Lake Tai, or Shanghai, which is located a little bit further east, or Yangzhou, which is north of the Yangtze River, or Yiwu, which is quite a bit south in Zhejiang province, or in Jiaxing, which is located here. So all of these places are in the Jiangnan region, and they are actually closer together than I probably just made them sound. At any rate, all the paintings I'm showing you tonight are from this area. Some of them were made by women, but in some cases, the best comparable paintings I could find were made by men. I will signal the gender identity of the painter when we get to the paintings. I don't think we should assume that women and men saw things the same way or worked in the same way. However, I am going to be starting with a painting made by two women, two sisters in fact, Chai Jingyi and Chai Jingyi. Chai Jingyi seems to be the younger one, and she was an early member of the Banana Garden Poetry Club. And her collaboration with her sister represents the only artwork I can find that was made by any of the Banana Garden poets. In fact, I will point out really quickly that I have structured the whole talk as a discussion of relationships among two women and how they are realized through painting or writing or both. So we're actually starting with the painting that represents the relationship between the Chai sisters. So on this slide, you should be able to see the opening section of this painting. The painting is called Flowers and Insects, and it's a hand scroll painting made in ink and color on paper, currently in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. The Art Institute of Chicago website gives it the very broad date of 1622 to 1722, which corresponds to the Kangxi reign era in China. But since Chai Jingyi is known to have died in 1680, I am assuming that the painting therefore must be between 1662 and 1680. As art historian Marcia Halpler has pointed out, Chai sisters collaborated often enough that they had a seal with both their names, and it actually appears on this painting, and I will be showing you a glimpse of it in a minute. This seal, the existence of it, speaks to the fact that the activity of painting could be the basis of a bond between women, and that women could see making art as an important element of their identity. Don't actually consider this painting to be part of the output of the Banana Garden Poetry Club, precisely because we know that the older sister, Chai Jingyi, was not actually a member, only Chai Jingyi was. What this painting does is it shows us one of the subjects that Chai Jingyi was known to specialize in, the flower and insects genre of painting. And it demonstrates that the Chai sisters were talented artists. They paint naturalistically with a great deal of precision. I'm going to see if I can magnify this slide so that we can actually see details of this painting a little bit better. Let me move it down so that my face is not in the way. So as I mentioned, this is actually the opening section of this long hand scroll. And the painting again is called Flowers and Insects, and it represents this genre of painting called Flowers and Insects. And the content of the painting is exactly what you would expect. It's representations of flowering plants, as well as various species of insects, and they are actually painted with great precision. In fact, I think the line work especially shows a great deal of control. And the colors, I would say, are probably extremely true to life. I feel as I look at this, I'm actually seeing specimens of plants and insects must be identifiable. Perhaps the only thing that is maybe not naturalistic about this particular painting is the beautiful way that each of these specimens of plants and insects receive a certain amount of attention, don't overlap with each other generally. They sort of show up in a really steady rhythm that really invites a viewer to sort of look at each one in turn. And I think the other thing that may not be very naturalistic is that we're seeing a great many species all at once in the same pictorial space. So I think that though each individual insect is very naturalistically rendered, and each individual plant or flower is also naturalistically rendered, I believe that this is actually a bit idealized. It doesn't really represent the chaos of nature, if that makes sense. At any rate, this is perhaps a good place for me to move forward. I don't have slides of the entire painting. I have this opening section, and then I have 2 slides from the end of the painting. So this is actually closer to the end of the painting. And this is, again, still Flowers and Insects by the Chai sisters. This particular detail is one that I actually really enjoy. You can see various kinds of stinging insects sometimes throughout this image. And this is an insect that I believe is probably a grasshopper, sort of perched on this plant. And then down here is an insect that I think may be a cricket. You can sort of see at the bottom left of the screen. These are actually painted in a way that really sort of points out the differences between these 2 insects. I'm specifically noticing details of the legs and how they're positioned. As I look at this, and it's really blown up here much larger than it is in real life, I'm really struck by all the details you can see of, like, fine lines that define antennae, or, you can see the thorax of the insects very clearly. You can see their wings and sometimes patterns on the wings, which is definitely the case with the cricket. So again, this is a painting that derives from very careful observation and really expert control of the brush. Okay, moving on to the last section of the painting. This is a section of the painting that actually has an inscription on it, which is just visible here. And it also has the artist's seal right after it. So I will read these out because I know when you have words on a screen, what everybody starts doing is they start to read them. So the artist's inscription says, ladies of Hangzhou, Chai Jingyi and Chai Jingyi copied this together in the Frozen Fragrance Chamber. Frozen Fragrance Chamber is undoubtedly the name of the studio in which they painted. Then seal is, again, the seal that has both names of the artists and represents that they work together regularly. And the seal says, Zhen Jing He Tong, collaboration of Zhenyi and Jingyi. The artist would not have bothered to have had a seal with both their names made unless they worked together on a regular basis. And so what this really does tell us is that painting together was an important aspect of their lives, and it seems to have been an important element of their identity. This particular painting is also, this section of the painting is also very beautiful, and I want to quickly magnify it so that we can see some of the details. There's a cicada that's sort of represented here now at the top right. And there's a spider sitting on a web, and the web is beautifully rendered. You can actually see like individual lines of the silk. You can see like the sections of the web sort of radiating out from the spider who's sort of sitting at the center. You can even see that the web has managed to catch a couple of insects. And all of this is just, painted again with the most precision and attention to detail. So at any rate, this gives us a sense of what Chai Jingyi's painting may have been like, and but also that she was in the habit of working with another woman artist. And I think both of those things are really important for understanding the paintings of the Banana Garden Poetry Club. All right, the Banana Garden Poetry Club, the Qiaoyuan Shi, seems to have been active between about 1665 and 1675. And the literary scholars who work on this club have described membership in the club as being relatively fluid. We do know that at any given time, it was a small group of women. And the women include the 5 who are shown here, all of whom are coming up in tonight's lecture. So the first one is the one we've already talked about, Chai Jingyi. Her courtesy name was Qian. She died in 1680. I should mention that I'm starting off with the names of each of these women. I also am providing their courtesy names because these were the names that they commonly used to address each other, use these names in their writings to each other especially. A second member was Feng Xian, courtesy name Youling, and we don't actually have life dates for her, unfortunately. Third member is Qian Fenglun, courtesy name Lin Yining. She lived from 1644 to 1703. A fourth member was Lin Yining, courtesy name Yaqing, who lived from 1655 to about 1730. And then a fifth member is Gu Se, whose courtesy name was Ji, and for her, we again don't have life dates. There are, of course, other members of this club as well. I'm trying to focus on the ones who seem to have been the most active painters and who also had clear relationships with each other. So all 5 members of this group seem to have been active in ways that overlap with each other. And I think that's meaningful for understanding the relationships among these women. I want to start with 2 of them. So again, we're going to start with the relationship between these 2 women, Feng Xian and Lin Yining, who appear to have been merely friends, although I do think that it was a close friendship. For our description of the activities of the Banana Garden Poetry Club, we can turn to an account that is written by Lin Yining, and it's an account that attests to her close friendship with Feng Xian. The text also mentions the other 3 club members that I'm discussing tonight. I'm going to move forward to that text. The text is the afterword to a collection of Feng Xian's poetry called Collection of Singing and Harmony, and this was authored by Lin Yining. The fact that Lin Yining was asked to write the afterword is something that I think proves that she and Feng Xian would have been understood as close friends. This is actually just an excerpt from a much longer passage. Again, it's the part of the passage that really describes the activities of the poetry club. Here's what Lin Yining says about it. We had a number of regular meetings per month. At the meetings, we selected a rhyme and a theme for poetry composition, then recited the poems until evening came. Moreover, each of us put forward our female relatives by marriage for membership, such as Chai Jingyi Jixian, Li Duanming, Qian Fenglun Yunyi, and Gu Se Qiji. We found the intimate friendship of gold and orchid, and our homes were abundant in snow and willow catkins. The chapters and slipcases for our collected linked verses expanded with the days and months. So this particular passage discusses how the Banana Garden poets approached poetry composition at their meetings. When they would meet regularly, they would choose a rhyme scheme, would choose a theme, they would all get together and they would write poetry. And when they were done writing their poetry, they would recite it to each other and they would spend the whole day doing this. I also like that this particular passage explains how new members joined. It seems to have been that the existing members were recommending their relatives by marriage. It does seem that all of them became true friends, and the passage does say that they found the intimate friendship, which I think is very evident throughout all of their written works. And I suspect that these friendships in some ways may have been maybe more nurturing or more important to them than their family connections would have been. There are a number of paintings that actually represent literate women in China. I was trying to find one that I thought might give the feel of a women's poetry club. This is one that's from about the right time that I think does suggest that kind of feeling. So this is a painting, it's an album leaf. So it's a painting that is part of an album. And the leaf is referred to by the descriptive title, Two Women with Books and Scrolls. The whole album is called Scenes of Women in Domestic Settings. And this is a painting whose artist is unknown, which means it actually could have been made by a male artist or a female artist. It's not entirely clear. This does date to the Qing dynasty in the mid-17th century. It's done in ink and colors on silk, and it's now in Germany. It's in the collection of the Museum für Ostasiatische Kunst in Cologne. James Cahill has suggested that this could represent the member of Women's Literary Society. And what this painting is really showing is a woman sitting on a couch, resting her hand on a stack of volumes that are enclosed in a slip case. This is actually very easy to understand as published volumes of poetry. And then the woman who's approaching her seems to be carrying a bundle of scrolls. And just the scrolls and the books together are enough to suggest that these are literate women who actually appreciate reading and writing. So I think that this is a painting that may hint at the idea that some women are actually forging connections with each other based on shared love of writing and poetry. Next, I want to turn to the relationship between two of the Banana Garden poets again. So these are Lin Yining, Qian Fenglun, and they are friends and sisters-in-law. Lin Yining was married to Qian Fenglun's brother. And there are a number of writings that actually attest to their close relationship, but the one that I want to focus on is a letter written by Qian to Lin. So here is this text, and I will again read it out and then discuss it. So here's what this says. Formerly, there were 5 who met in the Banana Garden. Now, Qiji has departed up north. We who remain are separated by only a few steps, but have had to resume our various mundane duties. For a long time, we have been estranged. In vain, we think deeply about the clouds over the mountains and the moon above the rafters. The pleasures of unfolding a sheet of writing paper beneath the blossoms and idly trimming a candle's wick at the window are distant and out of reach. So this opening passage of the letter indicates that there are 4 people who are remaining in Hangzhou, and these are again the members of the Banana Garden Poetry Club. They regularly meet in the Banana Garden. The letter is inspired by the departure of Gusa, who has gone north. The letter continues. So it goes on. Just now, seeking a lifelike portrayal, I personally painted a picture of our elegant gathering in the Banana Garden. I placed the 5 of us among tall pines and luxuriant bamboo, clear springs and white rocks, enabling our spirits to mutually support each other forever, and this momentary yet beautiful affair to be passed down through 1,000 autumns. Admittedly, I would not dare put our literary works up against those of the 7 sages and 6 hermits, but our profound immersion is nearly identical. This is the end of the letter. And this part of the letter is describing how Qian Fenglun is inspired by the departure of Gusa to make a painting that recalls when all 5 of them were together. So she sets it in the Banana Garden, which is where they, I believe, met from time to time. I believe they also met other places. They met at each other's residences too. She sets it in the Banana Garden, which is the garden that gives the club its name. She picks all 5 of them. She places them in a garden setting, right, with tall pines and bamboo clear springs and white rocks. And she says that she's hoping that in this way, the collective is actually preserved, at least in the picture, as if their spirits are together in the picture and the picture has actually captured that. So I feel like this painting that she's making is speaking to the fact that the Banana Garden poets really saw themselves as part of a group. They really had developed a very strong collective identity, which Qian Fenglun is expressing both in her letter and in her painting. It's also clear that Qian Fenglun is considering writing and painting as equivalent avenues of commemoration and as ways of expressing nostalgia. She does mention that there are 5 of them. It's not entirely clear who the other 2 are, right? Because again, the roster of the club members does rotate, but clearly it includes Qian Fenglun herself. It must include Lin Yining, who she's writing to. It's inspired by the departure of Gusa, so Gusa must be a 3rd. And then for the 4th and the 5th, it is very possible that it's the ones that I've been talking about tonight, Chai Jingyi and Fengxian. I will say one more thing, and that is that this is a painting that I really wish I could find. It's not, I've actually spent a lot of time searching for the lost paintings of the Banana Garden poets. And I feel like this is one that I would really love to be able to see a portrait of all 5 of them. And I feel like it's rather ironic that Qian Fenglun has said that she is expecting that her painting is going to preserve knowledge of the group through 1,000 autumns, when apparently the painting appears to be lost. To find a comparable painting, there are actually a number of possibilities. There's nothing that really specifically depicts what is obviously a women's poetry club. There is this painting, which is currently in the Nanjing Museum, that does show women in a garden setting, seated at a table with some scrolls on it. This is a painting by the male painter Yang Jin, and it's a detail of a hand scroll painting that is a title that might be translated "The Rich and Powerful at Leisure." Yang Jin is a male artist, again, as I said, and he's from Changshu in Jiangsu province, so that is actually the Jiangnan area. We think that the painting is made in 1688. It is dated, so that is about 10 to 15 years after the activity of the Banana Garden poets. So this is actually close in time and close in place to the activities of the Banana Garden Poetry Club. It is showing literary women. If I blow this up a little bit, that becomes more evident. So we have these 2 women seated at the table. Here's the book. Here are the scrolls. There are actually other people surrounding them. I don't think that these are people of the same status. And so I would hesitate to call this really a literary gathering. In fact, the whole of the painting suggests that perhaps what is happening here is that we are having details of the different activities of a single household. In the background, you can actually see a bamboo grove, which Qian Fenglun mentions as being part of her painting. And the trees that are right behind the table are actually growing out of rocks. There are also rocks in the foreground. So there is some correlation of imagery between this painting and Qian Fenglun's lost painting. To see a proper representation of a literary gathering, though, we have to look for paintings that show men engaging in this kind of activity. And so this is actually a painting called Exalted Gathering in the Green Woods, currently in the Minneapolis Institute of Art, which is a painting that dates maybe a few decades before the activities of the Banana Garden poets. It dates about the year 1620, and that is in the late Ming dynasty. And this is, again, a hand scroll painting done in ink and color on paper. The poets, or the scholars, I should say, but I'm sure they were actually poets, right? Because it is a literary gathering. The scholars who are represented in this particular painting have all been identified. Many of them are the leading scholars of their day. This is a painting that is actually in a garden setting, so that does have the same kind of setting that would be found in Qian Fenglun's lost painting. And we do think that this is made in the Jiangnan region, and we can sort of determine that by thinking about who these people are, where they were located. So there are two people sort of sitting here in the left part of the composition. One of them is the scholar Zhao Yiguang, who was from Suzhou, and that is in the Jiangnan region. The central group of three figures, which includes a man playing a zither and a man at a table, which I need to focus on a little bit more closely in a minute, and another man here carrying a staff and wearing a hat. This group of three includes another person from Suzhou, another prominent scholar named Wang Zhideng. And finally, the two people at the far right are both from Shanghai. So we have Chen Qiru and the eminent painter and connoisseur and scholar Wang Qichang. So Wang Qichang and Chen Jiru are from Shanghai. Wang Zhideng and Zhao Yiguang are from Suzhou. And so it's actually possible, I would say, that painting could have been made in either place. I would actually need to do further research on this to figure out if it can be determined where this group of people actually met, and that would really solidify the region that this came from. Let me focus a little bit on central group. So again, there is a man back here who has a brush in his hand. He's seated at a table. There's a scroll of paper in front of him. So it seems like he could be preparing to write. And I would say that focusing on this section of the painting makes it very clear that this is the garden rather than the wilderness. So first of all, there are very prominent garden rocks. There's one here that's quite dark and really noticeable. It really stands out in the composition. There's a second one here that's sort of a light brown color. Both of these are representations of the kinds of limestone garden rocks that were commonly collected by scholars and placed in their gardens. And then if you look behind the man with the writing brush, you can see that there's actually a stream and there's a stone slab bridge crossing the stream. And so I think that's another thing that suggests that this is really a garden and not the wilderness. In the background, there is actually a bamboo grove, right? So now we actually have a stream and we have rocks and we have a bamboo grove. These are the kinds of things that appeared in Qian Fenglun's lost painting. And we also clearly see that these are scholars who are doing scholarly things like playing the zither or getting ready to write, or just enjoying each other's company in this beautiful setting. I imagine that Qian Fenglun's painting may have similarly had a close focus on the individual figures, 5 members of the Banana Garden Poetry Club, and probably showing them doing things like that, holding writing brushes, or clearly enjoying each other's company. Another painting a bit later that shows a literary gathering is this one. And I'm actually showing you the whole composition at the very top of the slide. And then in the bottom right corner, a detail of the opening section. This is a painting by 2 artists, Fang Shishu and Fang Lin. And the painting is called The Ninth Day Literary Gathering at Xing'an. This is a painting currently in the Cleveland Museum of Art. It's a bit later. It dates to 1743, which is in the Qing dynasty, but this is probably about 70 years after the activity of the Banana Garden poets. But again, it provides us with a model of what a painter trying to depict people at a literary gathering might be emphasizing. If we focus on the detail that I have down here at the bottom right, I'll just blow it up for a minute. Actually, the artist Fang Shishu is represented here. He's the man seated in the background at this table, holding a scroll in his hands. There's antiquities on the table behind him. There's also a pile of books. And so this is actually a representation of the painter himself, and he's actually holding a scroll. And then next to him, there are other people who are members of this poetry club. 2 of them are actually seated adjacent to a landscape painting that is mounted as a standing screen. If we zoom back out, we can see that in the background, there are rocks. And in addition, there are actually banana trees. So these are exactly the kinds of plants that I would expect to see in Qian Fenglun's painting of the banana garden, where the banana garden poets sometimes met. I do have another detail of this particular painting. So this is later detail. It's actually a little bit further on, a little bit further to the left in the whole composition. And this is actually showing a group of people sort of seated together. There's actually a man here seated at a table. But here we actually have a man seated in a chair, and he's unrolling a scroll with the help of a man who's seated over here on a stool. So they're sort of stretching out this scroll between them. And you can see that there are men behind them who are sort of looking on very eagerly, trying to see what's going to be on the scroll. So I imagine that at a literary gathering, you also have viewings, right? Scrolls of either calligraphy or painting. I would imagine that this is also a thing that Qian Fenglun might have put into her own painting. And behind them, there's actually a representation of a bamboo grove as well. I didn't mention very much about this poetry club, I don't think. I should mention that this is a Yangzhou poetry club. So this is from the correct region of China. Yangzhou is also counted as part of the Jiangnan region, despite being north of the Yangtze River. And so again, this is from, within the century, and it is about the right place. And this one is at least a representation of a men's literary gathering. All right, turning back to the Banana Garden poets and the things that they created. I now want to turn to the relationship between these two members, Qian Fenglun and Chai Jingyi, who were friends, but also seem to have been cousins-in-law. This is a relationship that is actually mentioned in the title of one of Qian Fenglun's poems. And what I'm actually showing you here is a page from the anthology in which this poem is reprinted. And you can actually see the title of the poem written, let's see. First, there's a short 3-character phrase, which is identifying the melody of the song lyric, because this is a poem written in the genre of song lyric. And then there's a column that actually provides the title of the poem. And so what all this says is the following. So the melody is the water dragon's chant. So this is to the melody of the water dragon's chant. And the title says, "Missing my older cousin's wife, Chai Jingyi Ji Xian," and simultaneously thanking her for her painting of plum blossoms. I actually just want to talk about the title. I don't really have time to talk about the whole poem. There are other things that I'm hoping to focus on, but the title for this piece alone is very revealing. I would have assumed that Qian and Chai were close based on the kinds of writing that they are doing in relation to each other. But this is a title that suggests that they actually have a familial relationship. Qian is using the word Sao to explain her relationship to Chai Jingyi. So in order to explain this, I first need to mention that Chinese kinship terminology is extremely specific. Sao is the wife of Biaoge, and Biaoge is your older male cousin through the maternal line. So what that suggests that Chai Jingyi may have been married to Qian Fenglun's older male cousin on her mother's side. Now, I would say that this is actually a possible relationship, although I'm not able to confirm it. The reason I cannot confirm it is that we do know who Chai Jingyi's husband was. His name was Shen Hanjia. The problem is that I cannot find who Shen Hanjia's parents were. And so that means I cannot confirm whether or not he was actually a cousin of Qian Fenglun's. But I do think it's possible. We don't know who his mother was, but she could very easily have been Qian Fenglun's maternal aunt. And I don't see any reason why we would not believe what Qian Fenglun is saying about the relationship in the title of this poem. So that suggests that they were friends, but they also had a familial relationship through marriage, right? That they do have this kind of deeper connection. The other thing that this title is doing is it's indicating how the poem came to be written. Chai Jingyi had made a painting of plum blossoms. She had given it to Qian Fenglun. That Qian Fenglun had been so appreciative of the painting, she wrote this poem in response. And that she's actually thinking, I think, of the poem as a meaningful thing to give back to Chai Jingyi in return. So the title is suggesting that the paintings were understood as meaningful gifts among these women, and they were actually understood to have personal meaning and to say something about the closeness of their friendship. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. I also want to talk about what Chai Jingyi says about her friend Qian Fenglun. And so now I want to move on to a very long poem. This particular poem is written by Chai. It's called Missing Qian Fenglun, Yun Yi, and describing her picture. I'm going to read it first. Maybe I'll read what's on the screen and then comment on what we can see in this part, and then it actually goes on to a second screen. So anyway, here's what this poem says. It's a poem that I really love. Remembering back to the first time I met with you face to face, clasping hands in the famous garden, the flowers like pellets of snow. First, there was Gusa Qiji, then Lin Yining Yaqing. Old writing from the Jade Terrace, startled by new developments. There were several from the women's quarters who understood the music. I am sad that the season of blossoming was cut off from celebrations. Pure wind in the forest, moonlight on the tower, and often in a dream, I come to meet you again. So close, yet worlds apart, and we cannot connect. Yet suddenly, I come face to face with you, a painting. Newly made up, resplendently beautiful, putting spring blossoms to shame, garments of thin silk just beginning to stir in a half-formed breeze, dangling golden hairpins shining in the sun, a pair of hibiscus ribbons fluttering. All right, so starting with this particular section, Chai Jingyi is missing her friend, and she is writing this poem on a picture of Qian Fenglun, and I do want to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But one of the things I want to say first is that this is a nostalgic piece. Chai Jingyi is remembering back to when they first met in a garden, and she is also mentioning two of these other club members, right, Gusa and Lin Yining. She makes references to poetry from the Jade Terrace. That could actually refer to collection Songs from Jade Terrace, which is a very old collection of poetry about women and by women in some cases. So I think that is actually an allusion to women's participation in literature. And then there's a line that says, there were several from the women's quarters who understood the music. That is meant to indicate very, very close friendships. Understanding the music is referring to a famous story about two friends. One is named Boya and one is named Zhongziqi. And they were so close that they could communicate even without words. As the story goes, Boya is somebody who improvised on his stringed instrument regularly. And he could be thinking of something or feeling something and putting all of that into his music. And Zhongziqi could listen to the music and understand it without Boya having to explain it in words. So this reference to understanding the music is meant to indicate people with a very strong connection. My advisor, Marty Powers, often uses the word soulmate to translate this particular term. Yes. Oh, then Chai Jingyi comes face to face with a painting of Qian Fenglun. Then I think the last lines that we can see on this slide are actually describing how Qian Fenglun looks in that particular painting. She's depicted as a beauty. All right, the poem goes on, and I will continue reading it. Vermilion fence has several bends and opens to a silvery pool. Paired mandarin ducks fly beside the flowers. Now, speaking of these birds also makes one happy. Emerald feathered, red beaked, brilliant as figured silk, impervious to dust from birth. Day after day floating on the spring waters of a pool. Days are full of spring winds that throw flowered silk floss into disorder. Feeling affection with melancholy admiration. Wonder where my friend is gone. I must be content to obtain this painting and write of this life, transform into rosy clouds and together fly away. So this section of the painting, this is the closing part of the poem, actually starts with the imagery of paired mandarin ducks, which is an interesting choice on Chai Jingyi's part. Paired mandarin ducks are often evoked in poetry to suggest connection between romantic partners. Normally we think of mandarin ducks as mating for life. And so I think that Chai Jingyi's choice of this imagery suggests that she and Qian Fenglun have a relationship that is similar to a romantic partnership and is one that is very enduring. And so I think that's a really interesting choice of imagery on Chai Jingyi's part. And she closes with mention that the entire poem has been inspired by this painting of Qian Fenglun, that this is all she has of her friend because at the moment they happen to be separated. I I would say that the tone of the poem throughout is rather melancholy, and you can definitely feel that Chai Jingyi is really missing her friend and thinking back very fondly to the time when they were together. I think that this poem is actually really quite moving, but I also want to point out that this has to be a separation. It's not that Chai Jingyi is not missing Qian Fenglun because, for example, Qian Fenglun has died. We happen to know that Chai Jingyi dies first in 1680. Qian Fenglun dies 23 years later in 1703. So they're just separated. But if Chai Jingyi is reacting this way to their separation, you can see really how very close to each other they really are. Right. This is another painting being described in a poem that I so wish I could see. And I will say thing that I don't think I have said, which is that the picture in question has inspired this poem. Chai Jingyi is evidently writing this poem in order to inscribe it in the negative space of the picture. So what that means is that the poem that Chai Jingyi inscribes in her own calligraphy on the picture of Qian Fenglun will visibly document the relationship between the two. Because of course, actually anybody can read this poem and understand what it's saying, at least if they are literate in Chinese. The other thing I would say about this is that it's not entirely clear who made the portrait of Qian Fenglun. And I can actually see two possibilities. The picture in question, which no longer, well, I shouldn't say it no longer survives, just that I cannot find it, which is not the same thing. Missing picture could have been Qian Fenglun's self-portrait. It could have been a portrait that Qian Fenglun made of herself. It's also possible that it's a portrait that somebody else made of Qian, and that just seeing a portrait of her friend is enough to make Chai Jingyi write this poem. So that part is not clear. The authorship of the picture is not clear. The fact that Chai Jingyi is writing this poem and inscribing it on the portrait of her friend is enough to suggest the closeness of their relationship. And it's again a case where a painting is very clearly inspiring a poem. So again, there's this circuit of exchange that's happening. All right, to find a comparable painting, I thought this would be a good one. So this is by a woman artist, Ni Renji. And Ni Renji made this painting in 1670. It's called Lady After a Song Artist. 1670 is exactly during the time period when the Banana Garden poets are active. And Ni Renji is somebody who lives in the Jiangnan region. She is from Yiwu in Zhejiang province. This is a hanging scroll in ink and color on silk, and it's now in the collection of the Zhejiang Provincial Museum. What this painting is showing is a beautiful woman standing in a landscape. There's mountains in the background, there are rocks in the foreground, there are rocks directly behind her. There's a lot of writing actually at the top of this particular painting. You can actually see some characters right at the top right, and then Ni Renji's signature and date are occurring a little bit further to the left. Maybe this would be a good thing to blow up really quickly. Right, so you can see that there's a very long passage here, and this actually gives us a visual for what it would be like to write something and inscribe it on somebody's painting. This is basically exactly what that would look like. And then the figure, the detail of the figure, it's very evocative, right? So it's a woman who's rather demurely dressed with beautifully coiffed hair. She's holding a gorgeous fan that is painted. And I believe the painting is a painting of lotus blossoms, which has all kinds of interesting poetic associations. And then she has like these beautiful ribbons suspended from her waist, and I believe they're actually hibiscus colored. So this is, you know, a model maybe, or an example of what the portrait of Qian Fenglun may have looked like. And again, this is a painting by a woman artist from exactly the right time, very close to the right place. All right, there's one last relationship I want to talk about before I close. That is the relationship between the two Banana Garden poets, Lin Yining and Gusse. And these two were friends, but they do also have a kind of familial relationship that is just distant enough that there's no good term for it in Chinese. What the relationship was that Gusse's sister was married to Lin Yining's brother. So that's not a direct relationship between the two of them, but it does suggest that they have a sort of peripheral familial relationship. The closeness of these two can be again seen by looking at writings that involve both of them. One of them is a poem is written by Gusse as an inscription for a painting by Lin Yining. And so the poem is titled Inscription on a Painting by Lin Yining, and it reads as follows. Plum blossoms and bamboo leaves intertwined, and glossy ink dripping wet, arranged in order, then slanting again. I remember last night beneath the bright moon, the crisscross scattered shadows trailing across the window's gauze screen. So this is a rather short poem. It is one that Gusse wrote when she was inspired by a painting that Lin Yining had made. I'm assuming that it is actually a painting that Lin made of plum blossoms and bamboo leaves. I should, of course, point out that the genre of poems on paintings, tihuashi, sometimes there's actually a very obvious relationship between the poem and the content of the painting. And sometimes there's not that kind of relationship. Sometimes you sort of look at a painting and you read the poem on it and you think, how actually does this relate to the imagery in this painting? There's not always a relationship. But in this case, I do feel like Gusse is describing Lin Yining's painting, because the first two lines, it seems as that she's actually looking at a painting. And so it would make sense that the painting she's inspired by is Lin's own painting. So she's describing plum blossoms and bamboo leaves that are intertwined. She describes the quality of the ink that Lin Yining used to make them. She describes a little bit about how these plum blossoms and bamboo leaves are actually arranged in the composition, right? So all those things are happening that make me feel like Gusse is actually responding to Lin Yining's poem, or sorry, Lin Yining's painting with a poem that is really clearly showing how she feels about the painting. It is very possible that the painting was Lin's personal gift to Gu, and that Gu inscribed it to commemorate this particular occasion, as well as their friendship. It is also possible that the two were working collaboratively. Lin Yining made this painting, that Gusse saw it, wrote a poem for it, and that Lin maybe invited her to write the poem on the painting, but then the painting was then given to somebody else. And that maybe it was a collaboration between the two of them that was then used to sort of to sort of honor the relationship that they had with a third person. That would be very possible. I should mention that the poem is not directly addressing Lin Yining as a painter, but it does allude to an earlier woman painter. Last two lines are very clearly a callback to a woman artist of centuries earlier, Madame Li of the Latter Tang dynasty, who, according to legend, inaugurated the genre of painting bamboo in ink because she saw the wavering shadows of bamboo on the paper of her window on a moonlit night, and she was moved to trace them. And according to legend, this is the beginning of bamboo painting on ink. And so this last line where Gusse is talking about shadows of the plum blossoms and the bamboo leaves trailing across the silk screen of her window, it's meant to allow the reader to sort of remember back to that much earlier woman artist. So even though she's not directly mentioning Lin Yining's prowess as a painter, there does seem to be a kind of deliberate comparison between Lin Yining and this much earlier painter. I do think it's meant to be a complementary comparison. So to find comparable painting, I turned to a painting by a woman artist, Chen Shu. This is a detail of her painting called Flowers, which was probably made sometime between 1700 and 1735. This is just the beginning of a long hand scroll painting, horizontally oriented. This is done in paper, and it's currently in the collection, the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. This painting is really opening with the representation of a blossoming plum tree. And Chen Shu is a woman of the gentry class. She is from the Jiangnan region. She's from Jiaxing in Zhejiang province, and she's a very close contemporary of Lin Yining. She's only 5 years younger. The painting, unfortunately, does not have bamboo leaves. I would actually really love it if I could see plum blossoms and bamboo leaves intertwined in this painting. But I feel like this is actually close enough in a number of particulars to sort of give us the feeling. Particularly as I look at this beautiful rendition of this plum tree, I'm really always blown away by the gorgeousness of her translucent ink wash. Chen Shu is clearly somebody who is an extremely talented painter. And I feel like this translucent ink wash might actually be described as glossy and wet, just as Usa does in her poem for Lin Yining's painting. She's also painting the plum tree on the diagonal. And Usa's poem alludes to the idea that the imagery in Qian Fenglun's painting is sort of arranged on a slant. So I feel like there are some interesting areas of correspondence between this painting by a completely different woman and the missing painting by Lin Yining. All right, just want to say a few more words to wrap up, and I'm going to show you my bibliography slide while I do that. In so many ways, I feel like this body of material that I've been working on fits in perfectly with the series Intersections of Identity, Expression, Exchange, and Hybridity. The women painters I have discussed tonight are clearly developing identities as artists and poets that are based on their activities as a collective of women. Their act of forming a poetry club seems to be inspired by the literary friendships seen in men's poetry clubs of earlier periods. So we could perhaps say that they are adapting a male model of friendship to create relationships with each other that seem very much based on shared scholarly interests. So much of their creative practice is evidently based on exchanges, often with the painting serving as the initial inspiration for correspondence or poetry. And their writing is wonderfully expressive, which leads me to think that their missing paintings must have been as well. And when Banana Garden poets inscribed their friends' paintings with their writings, they made compositions that we might now describe as hybrid forms. So in conclusion, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you tonight, as it has been so useful for me to have an opportunity to think out loud about the activities of the Banana Garden poets. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Laura. Raying, do we have questions?
Not yet. So hi, everyone. I'm Rin Gao, a graduate student at KU and also a member of the DEAI committee. So if you have any questions, feel free to type in the YouTube chat box and we will see it and ask Laura on your behalf. But since I haven't received any questions so far, probably people need some minutes to bring their minds together. I will take advantage. Oh, okay, we have one. I will ask mine later then.
Okay, great.
So we have question from Logan, and Logan wants to know, do you think that there were major differences between how men and women in these types of poetry clubs wrote to each other?
That's a great question. Are there major differences in the ways that they wrote to each other?
Yes, like in this poetry clubs.
So I would have to say that I have been so focused on women's writings and women artists that this is actually something that I don't know that I can answer properly. One of the things I think I would say is that I would actually imagine that kinds of things that men's literary gatherings or men's poetry clubs are producing are probably working in very much the same way, that they're choosing themes to write about, that they are working together, that they are reciting their poetry, that they're doing all those kinds of things. I would also imagine that men's poetry would actually address the relationships among members, that they would actually, there was a thing that the women poets and painters are doing that it's basically a genre of poetry that's referred to as linked verse. And this is something that we know that men were doing as well. So in fact, I had a slide very early on that was describing the activities of the club. And there was a reference to, I had it in quotes, it was Snow and Willow Catkins. And that's actually a reference to the linked verse genre of poetry, where you choose a line from a poem and you have like a response that comes up with it, and you sort of jointly write a poem together this way. We know the Banana Garden poets did this, and men did that as well. So I feel like those kinds of activities are very much the same. And I feel like if men are doing that kind of thing as well, I do think it probably attests to their relationships. So I would imagine that probably the men are also writing in ways that address their friendships. I think that maybe they may be doing it perhaps with different imagery, perhaps less with imagery of beauties and more with different kinds of imagery that refers to something about the enduring quality or the enduring nature of their friendship. I think they would probably use different kinds of imagery, but I feel like the underlying emotion is probably the same. That's my very uninformed response to Logan's very fine question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Blanchard. We have another question coming from Morgan Williamson.
Yes.
And Morgan says, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, Dr. Blanchard. I have a question regarding the familial connections among the members of this group. I think it's Banana Poetry Club.
Yes.
And Morgan wonders, is this found only in female literature groups or others too? Thank you.
That's a great question as well. And thank you so much, Morgan. And it's so nice to see you here. I'm really happy to have you here with us tonight. All right, Morgan. Familial connections. I would say that there probably are not enough female literary groups to really pin down exactly what the relationships among them are. So it's hard to say whether or not this is usual, if that makes sense. The Banana Garden poets are, very highly admired. And I do think that there were other female poetry groups, but I don't think that they generally attain the same level of renown that these women did. And so it may be harder to trace the familial connections of those other groups. So this is actually something that I think I would need to do more research on. I do think that in male literary groups, I can definitely think of examples of poets who were brothers and would sometimes address each other. My own training is really in Song Dynasty art. And so I'm sort of thinking back to, I'm thinking back to Su Shi and his brother Su Che and how they wrote to each other all the time in poems. I'm not sure that I call that a literary group, but definitely we know that men address their family members through poetry. And so I would not be at all surprised to find men's literary groups that actually included, brothers or brothers-in-law or cousins or, it wouldn't surprise me at all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Blanchard. So now I think I have the chance to ask my questions. So I'm wondering, okay, we have another question coming. I will hold on to mine as a moderator. So yes. Here's another question. Says, do you know how these compilations of women's writing came about? Like, I suppose it's asking who compiled their writings. Yes. And it seems that several of them are from later periods like 19th and 18th centuries.
Yes, that's correct. All right. So what I would say first is that, if I'm not mistaken, most of the Banana Garden poets that I have talked about actually had their poetry published. So Lin Yining, for example, has had lots of her work published in her own collections. I mentioned Feng Xian's collection that Lin Yining wrote the afterword to. Chai Jingyi also was somebody who had her poetry published. So, if their poetry is being published in the first place, right, that means that it was considered to be good enough that people were interested in it. And undoubtedly what was happening at this time was that women whose poetry was being published were being supported by the members of their family, particularly by male members of the family who were more likely to have the scholarly connections and the connections to the publishing industry that would make it possible for single authored poetry collections by women to be published. So once that happened, though, once the books were created, they ended up in libraries. And there were multiple projects happening in the Qing dynasty that were trying to preserve women's writing. So this is actually a thing that feminist literary scholars have spent a lot of attention have spent a lot of time discussing and devoted a lot of attention to, right? So I would point to the work of people like Ellen Widmer, for example, or, Grace Fong or anybody like that who works on the Qing dynasty and works especially on women writers. There's a whole wealth of scholarship describing how anthologies were put together that were designed to preserve the work of women. So what the editors would do would be they would comb through the libraries, they would read the poetry, they would choose the best examples, and they would put them in their anthologies. Some of the editors were men, but some of them were women. So one of the anthologies that was edited by a woman was the anthology called Anthology of Correct Beginnings by Women of this Dynasty, Guoqiao Guishou Zhengshiji. This is written by or edited by Yun Zhu. And she was an amazing scholar. She wrote like prefaces for every poem, for every poet in her collection. And it's this incredible trove of Qing dynasty writing. So basically, first the poems were published in single authored collections, and then they were in libraries, and then people started to get really interested in the writings of women in the Qing dynasty, and they started like creating all kinds of anthologies that would preserve them. And, it's an amazing resource. I should also mention, I will just give a shout out to the Ming Qing Women's Writing Project at McGill University, which preserves so many of these writings in digital form. It's been an incredible resource, really incredible.
Thank you very much for that answer. And now I have two questions lined up.
Okay.
So first is from Changwan, and she says, thank you very much for sharing your in-depth research. And regarding the beautifully written poems and inscriptions in Chinese characters, are there any artistic or stylistic relationships or similarities between those written by the members of the club?
Oh, that's a great question. I have been mostly focusing on the examples that I would describe as poems on paintings, and not doing so much of comparing the poems to each other. But I do know, again, that they did linked verses, right? So I do think that anytime that they are working in the linked verse genre, where they're sort of collaboratively writing a poem, I do think that there has to be a kind of coming together of a certain kind of style to make it actually work as a poem. So there is at least that. Right. And as for artistic relations, I'm not sure if by artistic you're thinking very broadly and thinking about like poetry and painting. As I said, the paintings really are not findable. And I have like searched every major museum collection. I'm not sure that they don't exist. They could still be in private collections, but I'm not able to find them. So it's hard for me to say like if there are connections among the paintings.
Could I jump in and ask Laura, would these women have been practicing all three of the three perfections then, calligraphy, poetry, and painting?
I would strongly suspect that would be the case. Yes.
Because I was wondering if Zhongwan's question had to do with the actual calligraphy as a form of writing, but you only have the published versions of their poems, obviously. Yeah.
Yes. I was thinking about that as well. And, if I could have found a work of calligraphy by any of them, I would have brought that in. I would have been very happy to talk about calligraphy.
Right.
Yes. But, really, the only thing that I am able to find at this point are the published versions of the poems in printed anthologies. So I can't say anything about calligraphy, and I can't say anything about brushwork in that way. Unfortunately, really the only one that survives is that one by the Chai sisters, right? So Chai Jingyi, I don't even know which part of that painting Chai Jingyi did.
Right.
It could have been that they split it up.
But I was struck by that painting you showed, the final one by Chun Shu, which is in a looser style than the more fine linear style of the other images you showed. So I wonder if you could talk about that. I mean, do you think they were all working in a uniform style, or was there stylistic variation within their bodies of work?
That's a great question. So I would say that there could easily have been stylistic variation. And I think some people do have the skill to work in this really precise way, and other people have the skill to work in a really loose way. But I will also say that the artist Chun Shu, who's one of the better known women artists of the Qing dynasty, Marcia Hoffler wrote a great essay about her, right? And she's very well known because her son was very highly placed at the Qing dynasty court and actually presented many of her paintings to the emperor. So they ended up being preserved that way. Chun Shu's own work shows a great deal of variety. So she works in multiple genres. She is really well known as a flower and bird painter, but she also paints landscapes. She also paints parrots, and she works in many different styles. So like the landscape paintings look like any landscape painting, right? There's a real emphasis on a certain kind of strong brushwork. And then there are paintings that are using very precise brushwork, like the one of I think it's a white cockatiel, if I'm not mistaken. Or a parrot. It's a cockatiel or a parakeet or a parrot. I'm just blanking on it right now. It's actually a really famous one. That one has like really precise line work with fills in color. And then there's this painting that I love, which is flowers, which is done in this really loose style all the way through. And it's just amazing to look at. So even a single artist can work in many different styles. And so I would say that I would definitely think that there would probably be many styles represented among the paintings of the Banana Garden poets.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Blanchard. And we have one more question from our YouTube audience,
Great.
which speaks right to the identities probably of these women. And the audience wonders, in many societies, like the wealthy are often the only people that had the luxury to creating art and literature in their free time. So is it safe to assume the women in this group were wealthy people?
That is a great question. So they are all women that we would describe as being of the gentry class. And I would say that that means that at least they are comfortable, right? These are not people who are having to do manual labor. You know, they're not working on a farm. They're not peasants. They are people with leisure time exactly to do poetry and painting and to be able to meet for, you know, a day in a month and spend the whole day doing that. And, you know, that is a kind of thing that not everybody gets the privilege to do. So I do think that they are undoubtedly living very comfortable lifestyles at the very least.
Thank you very much. So I think I will wrap up our Q&A with finally my questions, which is regarding the viewership. I know we have not been able to locate any particular paintings done by this woman in addition, except the Chai sisters' work. But I'm wondering, have you ever found any records from the men that commenting on their paintings or their painting activities?
That's a good question. I have not found any yet, but I would say that this project is really still in its very early stages. And so I would actually love to find things like that. I will say that the Chai sisters and another member of the Banana Garden Poetry Club, who's actually Chai Jingyi's daughter-in-law, Zhu Rozi, these are people who are mentioned in Tang Shuyu's compilation History of Painting from Jade Terrace, Yutai Huashi. And Tang Shuyu's text is entirely compilations of excerpts from older art histories, almost all of which are written by men. I'm trying to think, is there a single female art historian in there? I don't think there is. I think they're all written by men. And so definitely these are women whose painting activities are being discussed in male authored art histories. So if their painting is being taken notice of in that way, I would imagine that if I dug into some of the Qing dynasty anthologies, and you know, again, many of those are edited by men. They will be including comments by men on the poetry. I think that when I dig a little bit further, I will definitely find comments that are written by men about the poetry. So I don't know if that answered your question. I feel like I may have lost track of what the question was.
Yes, you answered my questions. And thank you very much for all the information. It has been very helpful to my own work too. And I think that also wraps up our Q&A sessions for this lecture.
Okay, thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. I think in some ways, as much as you'd like to find these paintings, we can imagine what they look like. So in some ways, that's a kind of opportunity to, you know, to use our imaginations. And I think it was brilliant how you brought in paintings that may have similar motifs or similar sort of characteristics. So you know, I almost wonder about like whether you could commission somebody to make a painting, you know, based on the literary evidence you have, sort of. In fact, you could ask AI to do it, couldn't you?
Right. Oh my goodness, I hadn't even thought of that. I think I would say that I would hesitate to try to commission a painting based on these descriptions. There's the saying, right, that a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yes.
In fact, I think that was first said in Japan, if I'm not mistaken. And it was, a picture is worth 10,000 words. And I think even if we had 10,000 words describing these paintings, I would hesitate to try to determine what they actually look like based on that. I think we have a sense of the imagery. We have a sense of what the paintings meant and how they made their viewers feel. And I feel like that is a great beginning. And I would not at all want to commit to like trying to make a reproduction based on a textual description. I just feel like we couldn't possibly do it justice.
Yeah, that wasn't such a great idea after all.
No, it's actually one that's come up before. It's been suggested before, but I really feel like, I think maybe this is a case where thinking about what we do have that survives and using our imaginations is probably the best way forward. And I'm going to keep looking for the lost paintings.
Yes.
I can't imagine that they were all destroyed. I imagine that they're somewhere. It's just not maybe in a major museum collection, and that's why I can't find them.
Well, speaking of words, we appreciate your words this evening. We learned so much from you, enjoyed so much what you shared with us. And please, if you find any of these paintings, everyone who heard your talk tonight is going to want to know what you found. And I'm sure you'll publish that so that the world will know. So thank you again for being with us this evening. We thank the audience. Thank you for your engagement, your questions, and we'll wish you all a good evening.